Hello, my name is Jim Latola. Welcome to the Northeast Oakland County Historical Museum for this episode of Oxford History Today. In the last episode, I spoke briefly about the first non-town meeting at the Demings home, which was formulated basically to set up the government for the township or make the petition for a township government. It gets a little bit confusing, so I should clear it up. When Oakland County was originally laid out in 1819 and declared a county in 1820, there were only two townships in Oakland County. The southern half of the township was Bloomfield Township, and the northern half of the county was Oakland Township. So when I talk about the original pioneers or settlers coming here, they're actually coming to Oakland Township. As the population grew, they had the meeting to petition to have their own township and self-government. One of the things that occurred at that unofficial meeting at Demings was deciding on a town name. We talked about the 1877 history of Oakland County and about how some stories are told in a somewhat of a oral fashion. And the story of Oxford getting its name in that volume is that there was a three-member board. There was Samuel Axford, one of the Rossmans, and another person that formed a committee to decide on the new town name, and they decided on Oxford. After they had decided on the name, it was alleged that they were naming it after Oxford, England. There were still some bad feelings after the Revolution, so people would object to that idea. So then they said it was because all the farmers had ox teams, and therefore it was going to be named Oxford. One of the other theories was that it was a play on the name of Axford, making it Oxford. Well, as it turns out, Mr. Samuel Axford is actually Samuel Axford III. Samuel Axford I and Samuel Axford II come from Oxford Township, New Jersey. And it may be somewhat of a 19th century joke being pulled on us through history that they didn't know where the name came from, because there was other prominent families in the area that also had similar roots to Oxford Township, New Jersey. We also talked about Oxford Corners becoming the center of activity. Dr. Burdick and Dr. Pliny Powers had been at the Deming residence where they had set up practice. Dr. Pliny Powers had gone back to Detroit, giving up on the practice, and Dr. Burdick stayed. Dr. Powers didn't disappear from history. When the Republican Party was formed, he was a member of the First State Committee for the Republican Party. So his name continued on history, just not in Oxford's history. Dr. Burdick moved to Oxford Corners, and when he arrived here, he apparently befriended William Powell. Mr. Powell figured out that Oxford was about the midway point between Lapeer and Pontiac, and that it was a good area for a hotel for travelers. Would be about halfway, and if easy day's travel would be to Oxford, then they would be able to stay the night and then continue their journey the next day. So he came upon the idea of building a tavern. His tavern was the first wood frame structure in Oxford. And the term tavern at the time did not necessarily mean just the serving of alcohol. A tavern was generally synonymous with the term hotel. Dr. Burdick helped him build his tavern, and as they were building the tavern, Mr. Powell had his family living in the barn behind the hotel, which he had constructed first. The hotel wasn't completed when he moved his family into the hotel, and Dr. Burdick continued his practice in Oxford. Dr. Burdick eventually built a home on what is now East Burdick Street. Of course, the street is named in his honor. He owned about 3 acres there, and later in life, his wife started to subdivide that, and it was going to be the Burdick addition to the village. The Powell name comes up again because in the original mapping of this addition, the street was called Powell Street. When it was actually completed, that street name changed to Hudson, which was the married name of Dr. Burdick's daughter. For Dr. Burdick, medicine at the time was pretty primitive to what we expect today. There was no guarantee that when you went to a doctor that you would actually end up feeling better. Many of the medicines the doctor had were his own medicines that he compounded from things found in nature around the neighborhood, or things that he could go to Pontiac or Detroit to buy for medications. The limitations of being a doctor are fairly clear. Dr. Burdick and his wife had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. The 2 sons died pretty young, young ages, under 10, and one of the daughters never made the age of 25. So only one daughter of the 4 children survived to later in life. As to Mr. Powell, continued with the hotel business. When he came here from New York, he had 4 sons, him and his wife. One son continued on the family farm, continued to operate the family farm. One son went to the city of Chicago, where he was the agent for the railroad there, and did fairly well in the railroad business. One son served in the Civil War as a captain in a volunteer regiment. Eventually, the Oxford post of the Grand Army of the Republic was named after him. The other son, Joseph, he was had one child, and his first wife died when the child was fairly young. At that time, a Mr. Tom's had opened a store across from the Powell Hotel. His sister became known to Joseph Powell, and he remarried again. Mr. Tom's became involved in politics in the Oxford area, and as a result of this, Joseph Powell became active in politics also, and was eventually elected judge in probate court in Oakland County. He was known as Judge Powell after that. After he had served his terms in Pontiac as a judge, he returned to the Oxford area and continued to be prominent in the area. Some of the things he did includes the Powell Addition, which was an addition to the village at the northeast corner, where Powell Street is now located. There's approximately everything north of East Street to that east side of the village was the addition built by Mr. Powell. He also financed the Powell Opera House, or the Oxford Opera House. This was a well-known landmark in Oxford for many years, known as the Oxford Theater, and of course that was famous for the fire that occurred there in the early 1970s. I think there was a photograph that was pretty much sent around the world of a fireman stretching the hose out from the fire hall into the opera house fighting the fire, since they were next door to each other. Of course, the Powell name also lives on in Powell Lake, with Powell Lake Park located by the library. So the Powell name has a fairly lengthy and important history. There are other important achievements by other businessmen in the town, but those are 2 names that are prominent and remain prominent today, because there are streets named after them, additions named after them, and you see the names in your common travels around the town today. We'll continue with some other early pioneers after we come back for this brief interruption.
Catch us anytime on YouTube. Go to Oxford Community Television YouTube.
We'd do anything for kids. Yet 1 in 6 children in the U.S. struggle with hunger. Help end childhood hunger near you. Learn how at feedingamerica.org.
There's a lot of history to Oxford. Hidden around every corner, deep in every crack, and sometimes right in front of you, waiting to be discovered. If you just dig a little, you'll find the great history of our beautiful town. Welcome to historic Oxford.
Welcome back. Another family that was early to the Oxford area and important in its history is the Moyer family. Mr. Moyer was also born in New York and traveled to Michigan with his parents and family at a young age. They traveled to Buffalo, where they boarded the steamer Superior, which was the second or third steamship on the upper Great Lakes. After they had boarded the ship, the captain actually held it in port for several days. The Superior actually had the engines of the first steamship on the Great Lakes, the Walk in the Water. And the Walk in the Water had been destroyed in a gale and with the engines being salvaged. So the captain was aware of what a Great Lakes storm could produce. When the weather had cleared, the Superior traveled to Detroit, where the Moyers got off in the city of Detroit, which was just a small village on the edge of the frontier then. Senior Moyers purchased a yoke of oxen and a wagon, and they loaded their family possessions and started north, first traveling through the roads near Detroit and eventually settling into the swamp that led toward Oakland County. When they got out of the swamp, they continued on up following the Indian Trail to Rochester and actually settled just into Macomb County. Later on, after Mr. Moyers had grown up, he moved to Oxford and he began to purchase land. Eventually, and was one of the biggest landowners in Oxford Township. He owned all the land from Stony Lake all the way down to the current village. Is important for other reasons also. One of the things he became involved in was the airline railroad. And he saw that as the railroad passed through Oakland County, all the communities that it went by became prosperous. That railroad roughly came through from the west side of the county, came across through Pontiac, what was then Pontiac Township, Avon Township, Rochester, before continuing east into Macomb County. Being aware of this, he later promoted the Detroit Bay City Railroad. This was the railroad that first came to Oxford in about 1872. Because he was a large farmer, he was producing large and abundant crops, and he needed the transportation to transport his goods, and that's part of the reason for his support for the railroad. Of course, this railroad was eventually bought up by the Michigan Central Railroad, which became part of the New York Central Railroad. But interesting, the Michigan Central Railroad always maintained its name as far as the legal paperwork, because as a state railroad, it got special tax incentives within the state of Michigan, so was never actually called the New York Central Railroad, although they used New York Central locomotives and rolling stock. The Moyers family had a number of children, including John C., which is what Moyer Street in the village is named after. John C. developed his addition to the southwest portion of the village, and thus there's Moyer Street is located there in naming the family. After Mr. Moyers had passed, Mrs. Moyers continued to operate the family farm for many years. The farmhouse was located upon approximately where the hospital is located, just north on town on the west side of the roadway. She continued that. She had learned the business from her husband and continued that into advanced age. They never did have any grandchildren, and eventually, as different family members died, there was never really an heir to the Moyer estate that was a direct line. So the name Moyer, though it's still present as Moyer Street in the village, the name has pretty much disappeared from within the community. Mrs. Moyers lived until 1909, so she had a long and prosperous life. So while the Moyer name remains prominent for Moyer Street and the Moyer addition, probably the real important contribution by the Moyer family is the railroad coming through town. Before the railroad arrived in Oxford, Oxford was just a sleepy farming community. The businesses downtown were pretty much on what is now Washington and Burdick Street, from making it the four corners of town, or Oxford Corners. But when the railroad came through in 1872, that's when businesses really took off in Oxford, and it really became a prominent place. Not only as a farming community, but even as a business community. It ended up being the financial center for this part of the county. Most of the farm implements stores were in Oxford. There brought manufacturing, including Cooper's and a cereal factory and many other things. And that's what led to the many additions to the village, just for the housing for all the workers that were involved in business unrelated directly to farming. Also a common thing at the time, about the time the railroad came through, many of these farmers that had been pioneers were starting to retire. And it was much more convenient to live in the village than on the family farm. So you see many of the prominent names that had been involved in farming throughout the area become prominent people in the village. So the Moyer family made an important contribution. After our next break here, we'll talk about the Van Wagner family.
Abigail Adams here, just checking up on our springtime goat work on the Polly Trail. What's that? Trash on our beautiful trail? Oh, that makes me so happy. We've got so many trash cans all over the trail. It's a beautiful day on the trail, but oh no, this could end badly. Wow, that sure was nice. Folks know not to hog the road. Even goats share. Hey, that gets my goat. Where are you going? Even I have to be out here on a leash. You sure are a nice dog, but stay away from those weeds. I'm gonna eat them later. What a beautiful gift, our Polly Trail. I've got to hit the trail. I hope you will too.
The Van Wagner family is still a well-known family in the area. The family, again, was originally from New York. There were two brothers that had been contractors on the Erie Canal. Their whole family decided to come west. It's not clear why they chose to. You could obviously buy more property in Michigan than you could buy in New York just because of the difference in prices. But in any event, they loaded up their family, their friends, and they started almost a wagon train for Michigan that consisted of approximately 80 people, including the two brothers' mother and father. On their trip to Michigan, the mother died and was buried along the trail at an unknown location. The family continued to Michigan, and they were some of the first settlers in the Rochester area. The senior Van Wagner, Michael Van Wagner, died a short time after arriving in Rochester, and he was the first person buried in the Stony Creek Cemetery. The two Van Wagner brothers then moved up to Oxford. They had farms here in Oxford, and eventually they also had farming lands in neighboring Brandon Township. The interesting thing about the Van Wagner family is that many of them served this country through the years. The senior Van Wagner is said to have been a veteran of the Revolutionary War. The Michael Van Wagner II was a veteran of the War of 1812, and this family tradition of service continued. One of the interesting stories of the early days here was that you could often find your way around, and if even lost in the wilderness, you could find an Indian trail, and the Indian trail would usually lead to a landmark where you could find your way back home. One of the Van Wagner brothers had been in the woods and became disorientated when he was looking for some cattle, and it got dark and he was unable to find his way home. So he found a hollow tree log, and he crawled into a hollow tree log and spent the night inside this log. When he got up the next morning, he found an Indian trail and followed it, and it turned out that Indian trail led to a Mr. Seymour, that Seymour Lake Road is named after. And the family had been searching for him and came there and found him and took him back home, apparently in a confused state that he had become so disorientated. As I said, the Van Wagner family continued to serve their country, and the Van Wagners have this long tradition. When the Civil War happened, at least 3 of the descendants volunteered for the volunteer regiments during the Civil War and served in the Civil War. One of the Van Wagners, Lou Van Wagner, he had joined the Michigan National Guard just before World War II. When the World War II broke out, or just before the war broke out, his unit in the Michigan National Guard was nationalized and became part of the United States Army. He had enlisted in the National Guard as a buck private, and after he had served for a while, he had risen to the rank of lieutenant. When it was absorbed into the U.S. Army, he continued to hold that rank, and during World War II he served in Europe. While serving in Europe, he continued to rise through the ranks, and after the war he remained in Europe and was part of the general staff that actually handled the Berlin airlift because he had become an expert in logistics. After the Berlin airlift, he was then sent to the Far East Command in the Pacific, or when the Korean War broke out. So he handled the logistics there for the Korean War. As he was eventually promoted to Brigadier General. So he was actually, when he retired at the time, he was retired as a Brigadier General. So he's what they call a Mustang. Basically, he entered the service as a buck private and rose to the rank of general before he retired. Another famous Van Wagner descendant is Murray Van Wagner, who was one of the governors of the state of Michigan. And to this day, the Van Wagner family members still live in the area. They've contributed to their country and to the Oxford area through the years. And are prominent in that way. While again, they're one of the families you don't, surprisingly, you don't see many of the streets or things named after the family in the area. Similar to the Van Wagner family, the Hubby family was a family that became more well known, not so much for the parents, but again for their descendants. The Hubbys were also involved in the Erie Canal, or the construction of the Erie Canal, and when they came, Mr. Hubby was a child and came on a steamship, William Penn, which is supposed to have been the 5th steamship on the Upper Great Lakes. Again, they, similar to the Van Wagners, they arrived in Detroit. They proceeded north out of Detroit and came to the Oxford area. Mr. Hubby has always described himself as a farmer, and when you first look for where the farm is, it's hard to find on the old maps. But where they first become prominent is Mr. Hubby was at the very first official township meeting, and in fact was elected to a township office. He also purchased the Oxford Exchange Hotel. This hotel would have been located in the southwest portion of the Four Corners, and in direct competition with the Powell Tavern. He raised the family there. The family actually lived at the hotel and worked at the hotel to take care of their guests. They also acquired a family farm in the area, so there was a farm that was associated with the names. The important part is apparently the children learned pretty well from Mr. Hubby being a businessman at the Oxford Exchange, and 2 of them became very prominent in businesses in Michigan. The one son went to the west side of the state and he became a very prominent citizen and businessman in the city of Battle Creek. Horace Hovey, he went and he became involved in a timber business in Michigan, and also a large stock ranch and seed ranch up in Minnesota. Eventually, when the timber business was running out of timber in Michigan, he also became involved in large timber holdings in the southern U.S. He eventually was one of the founding members of the Dime State Bank. The Dime State Bank was in Detroit, was started on the principle that anybody with can open an account as long as they had 10 cents, and thus the name Dime Savings Bank. The bank became well known. It eventually built one of the first skyscrapers into the city of Detroit, a building that still exists to this day. The family had traveled around to the various parts of the states with the sons, but as they passed on, they all returned to the Oxford Cemetery because all of them considered Oxford to be home. That included the parents, and Horace and Horatio are all buried in Oxford Cemetery. So it was a prominent family that the children became more prominent than the parents, but the parents had pioneered Oxford, and they all considered Oxford to be their home, no matter where their travels took them. That'll wrap it up for today's episode, and we'll have more stories in the next one.
Canine Stray Rescue is Oxford's own local dog rescue. Each year they take in hundreds of dogs and bring them into suitable homes. A certified nonprofit organization, Canine Dog Rescue strives to give pound dogs a new leash on life. To donate, adopt, or even volunteer, call them at 248-628-0435 or go to their website, dogsaver.org, and click on the Canine Stray Rescue League link.
Hello, I'm Elgin Nichols.
And I'm Terry Stiles.
And together, Terry and I, we host a program called Oxford News This Week.
We cover all the news in our community, your backyard, Addison Township, Oxford Township, the village of Oxford, and Leonard. And you can catch us on Mondays through Friday. Right?
Right. Noon, 6:30, and 11 p.m.
Saturday and Sunday, 6:30 and 11 p.m. So don't miss it. Watch us on YouTube or our Charter Channel 191 or AT&T Channel 99. We will see you there.
We cure 80% of children with cancer. If you think about that, I mean, go back 50 years, we were curing 20 to 30%. This is the miracle story of modern medicine. There's one thing we're focused on here at St. Jude, and that's beating this thing.